In a way, I was present at the creation of Russia as we know it. Maybe this is the reason why I'm here now today. Before I join the discussants, the panelists, let me make some remarks as an introduction to the subject we are supposed to deal with. War has returned to Europe, to its eastern part. There we are witnessing not only a conflict, as some like to call it, especially in Western Europe and in Germany, but a real war, fought with heavy weapons and with thousands of victims. A war waged by Russia, or as I should probably better say, by the Kremlin, against Ukraine, in Ukraine. I would like to point to this fact right at the beginning of our deliberations and with full intent, because many people, in particular in Western Europe, obviously have got accustomed to this war, and as a consequence, more often than not, keep silent about it. In my view, they should be reminded that what is at stake in Ukraine is not just Ukraine and its people, but the fate of Russia and of Europe as a whole. Thus, the public discussion on foreign and security policy within Germany is suffering from a predominance of Russia, while Eastern Europe is to a large degree left behind. This imbalance in public awareness has, as many Germans, in particular from the liberal part of the political spectrum, have come to recognize, to be corrected in favor of the East European states, whose success depends to a large extent on how politics develops in the West. Such an effort would also be, as I will argue, an important contribution towards enhancing the security of Eastern Europe and of Europe as a whole. And to my mind, this seminar is an essential step in this direction. So far, my introductory remarks, and I will now go over to our panel, where Anatoliy Grytsenko, Taavi Rõivas, and last but not least, Henrik Bach Mortensen will give their presentation, then discuss among themselves, and then we open the discussion to the public.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for such an event and Friedrich Naumann Foundation and European liberals at large. It's a good chance to discuss in the setting basic fundamental things, as was mentioned during the presentation of our moderator. I believe without clear understanding of definition, diagnosis, including such issues as moral aspects, justice, we cannot arrive at solutions which will be sustainable and really ensure peace and stability and security, not only in eastern part of Europe, but Europe at large. First of all, let me introduce Ukraine. Not in terms of weak fighting with corruption, some delays in decisive reform in the country, etc., but in terms of security and Ukraine's input in peace and stability in Europe and beyond, which is lasting right now. Many people do not really understand the input and importance of that input, to put it on the current situation. Ukraine was the first country out of former Soviet Union republics, which in 1992 started real participation in peacekeeping operations throughout the world. And so far, more than 50,000 Ukrainian servicemen, soldiers, have gone through those missions. This record is quite a serious one. Not every EU or NATO member state can present that on the table, to be frank. Even during the war, current war against Ukraine, we are still ensuring peace and stability in Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Congo, Kosovo, etc., etc. During the war, we highly needed combat and transport helicopters on the battlefields. But 47 Ukrainian helicopters right now and before are still working for peace and stability all over. That must be acknowledged. It's a serious input. Not every EU, NATO member state have done that. Ukraine hugely invested in security and stability of the United States of America. 1994, I see here Colonel General Smishko, then he was a colonel, military attaché or defense attaché of Ukraine in Washington, D.C. I studied there in Air War College, being a lieutenant colonel. And our lecturers were Secretary of Defense, 4-star generals, and they mentioned figures. 14-16 billion US dollars annually for Pentagon budget, where they were spending, or in fact wasting, just to prevent nuclear strike from Ukrainian territory. We gave up those nukes, saving for the United States 14-16 billion per year. One can multiply by 20 plus years since then. Consider inflation, so it's an additional roughly 400 billion for the United States, just one Ukrainian step. To compare with some discussions, should Ukraine be given some javelins or something like that? Should Ukraine get 3 or 500 million support per year, etc.? Compare with 400 billion, just for one country. Ukraine has taken part in all, I stress all, NATO-led military operations. Unlike NATO member states, all of them, till now. Isn't it a sign that it's a European country, peaceful country, which 3 years plus back was within internationally recognized borders, still investing contribution into security overall? To acknowledge that country as a real one. Because when I hear discussions like there is no threat to supply weapons to Syrian opposition, etc., but Ukraine, why not? Some believe Third World War will start. It may start quickly in the Middle East. So who wants to look for solutions is that finds solutions. Who is looking for excuses, then they list reasons which are not really convincing. Moral aspects of that. You were right in your presentation, and for the last 10 years, we have witnessed 4 wars in Eastern and Central Europe. 2006, 2009, energy wars. Brutally closed gas supply, and a dozen plus countries midwinter had severe problems. 2008, real war against Georgia. Real war in all 3 spheres, land, air, and sea. And maximum which was said on the EU and NATO side, excessive use of force. That war was not even named a war, but it was a real war. And Georgians fought for freedom. Someone quoted Churchill earlier this morning. Really fought for freedom. They lost 2 republics. No one, besides a couple of rogue states, recognized those republics, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But they are under Russian control till now, and no one pretends to offer a real way to get them back under the Georgian control. Forgotten countries. 2014 until now, real war against Ukraine, real military aggression. From the same country, 4 wars. Is this war really named a war by lips of those who made Minsk settlement, etc.? No. Russia has not been even recognized as an aggressor. Putin brutally says he is a guarantor, like Germany and France, of peace in eastern Ukraine. And they buy that. Is it just sustainable solution and understanding? If we get together doctors and the patient who is sick, the first thing to make right diagnosis, then right treatment. If the diagnosis is wrong, then treatment will never be really sustainable and save that either person or country in this case. Other questions of the same kind. Why do we build armies? Just to have them? As a symbol of sovereignty or as a symbol of strong military political alliance like NATO is? To never use them? Why do we then waste billions and billions and trillions annually? For what? If time comes to really use or demonstrate or deter or deploy and employ if necessary, but we still keep stay calm, do not provoke, stay calm, do not provoke, there is no military solution. If there is no military solution, why do we need armies? Putin believes there is a military solution, and he proves that. Move a bit lower. Combating crime, police, forces, they use military solutions. They fight and shoot criminals who expose threat to people's lives, right? Fighting terrorism. No one has doubt. They deploy, employ forces, special forces, armies if necessary. Take France, for example, any other country, and right they do. And there is no discussions to just stay calm, do not provoke, please, and those terrorists to put as guarantors of fighting against terrorism. What do we do in terms of defense? Really? It's clear, and history will prove that at early stage of Russian aggression against Ukraine, Western representatives, those who were coming to Ukraine or permanent ambassadors, they were just stay calm, do not provoke, we'll manage that diplomatically, etc., etc. It's not an excuse for Ukrainian leadership, which must have protected the country. But Western position was such from the very beginning. It was wrong. If you looked at the decision which was proposed as the final document of those political consultations, diplomatic efforts, Minsk document, it's something we have been used during the communist times in former Soviet Union. No one read, but everyone supported. No one, besides a couple of diplomats, couple of people related to defense, other issues in every country, including Ukraine, has read the Minsk document, two-page document. Everyone says we support, there is no alternative, including currently elected American president, French president, etc. When Trump says we will force Russia to fulfill its part of commitments according to the Minsk document, there is zero commitment for Putin. There was zero commitment from the very beginning. What can you force? He was a guarantor according to the Minsk. It's a wrong assessment, wrong decision. Unfortunately, our European partners stick to that decision and really believe that they can manage aggression such a way. I stress, 4 wars during 10 years. The same aggression, the same country, the same personality. Was European and widely world response to those 4 aggressions, 4 wars, timely one, no, convincing one for Putin to prevent further steps of aggression, no. Convincing for the Europeans, for countries involved, no, no, no. And we keep that lip service, that mantra, as you said, rightly said. It's a solution. Minsk is a solution. We can rape Ukraine to fulfill Minsk. But Ukraine will stop existence within internationally recognized borders 3 years ago if we fulfill Minsk. No way. Can anyone find a single word Crimea in Minsk documents? Not at all. It's given away. 2 republics must be established in Minsk, in Lugansk and Donetsk, according to Minsk documents. They are not called republics. They found some hygienic, like special local governance, blah, blah, blah. But those republics will be real republics. They will not have Ukrainian police, own police, no Ukrainian prosecution office, their own, no Ukrainian judges, courts, their own. Unlike other 25 regions of Ukraine, those entities will have a right, power, authority to establish formal treaties with Ukrainian government, separate Ukrainian ministries, governments of foreign countries, etc. What is that? Moreover, full amnesty. Full amnesty. Full is a key word. When I ask our Dutch friends, would you forgive those who killed 300 of your own citizens, MH17? Not at all. But it's written, it must be fulfilled. You stress on that. Full amnesty without any exclusions. Moreover, the rest of Ukraine, besides Crimea and those 2 republics, must pay for that. Not aggressor must pay for destructions, Ukraine. Moreover, according to the document, to pay annually, fixing in the constitution their own status, and pay annually according to the protected budget lines. Protected budget lines means if, I knock the wood, we witness 4 Chernobyl-like disasters, we cannot reduce by even a penny payments for Lugansk and Donetsk from our rest of the country budget. Is it a sustainable solution? Can we be frank and moral, at least within such audiences, to stop that wrong lip service of state leaders? In my understanding, people who conclude such deals with Putin, who do not understand their responsibility for decades ahead, they are not political leaders. It's political animals. It's not bad language, it's political term. I am now teaching politology in the university. Political animals who are fighting for rating, who do not make decisions which are really needed, which will be sustainable, also tough, but who play with their electorate. I think it's really time to stress all of ourselves. Not only those who are in the eastern part of Europe, like us. We cannot become a NATO member. It was also part of the deal of Minsk. So we have to rely on ourselves. Mainly working, I would recommend our authorities with the United States and the Brits, because they are signatories of the Budapest Memorandum, and those are countries that can make their own decisions quicker than almost 30 countries through consensus-based decision-making procedure. But I would also, to finish my presentation, recommend what I recommended in a recently published article in the ALDE electronic publication on the future of NATO. I think NATO itself, if does not change the decision-making procedure, especially at the highest political level, and if does not return to the basic uniting factors back to 1949, then it can be transformed into, instead of confidence, conference building holy force, which will not be deployed and employed whenever is necessary to protect, if not Ukraine, but countries like Estonia and the rest. Because there is no real understanding, despite the current war against Ukraine, of the need to seriously ensure forward presence, high level of readiness and ability to demonstrate force and decisiveness, convincing for possible adversary if necessary. Few battalions to be deployed, it's important political decision, but it's not a decisive and convincing thing for Putin. I do not wish, but we should understand that what Putin did in Crimea, he can easily do in any Baltic state. While NATO leaders will be discussions, stay calm, do not provoke, we will make diplomatic efforts, etc. Because there is no real implanted in decision-making procedure possibility for the military part of NATO to go ahead immediately. They will wait for those political consultations. And to finish, that forward presence and real ability to show decisiveness of deterrence must include, first of all, countries who have special relations with, or at least seem to have special relations with Russia, namely France, Italy, Germany, etc. They must have their troops close to the front line, front state. Then we can together convince Putin, and we can return to real understanding of issues and looking for real solutions, not those mantras. Thank you.
May I give the floor right now to Mr. Rõivas? You all have 15 minutes. You may be shorter, of course.
Thank you very much. Well, I agree with a lot that has been said, except the last part. I think not even Putin is crazy enough to actually challenge the unity of NATO. And this is not a question of Estonia or Poland or Denmark. This is a question of whether there is credibility of transatlantic security order, and this is like a question of banks. You know, if there is one account in a bank where 100 euros or 100 hryvnias even is stolen, the trust of all of that bank is gone for good. And the same is with NATO. It's not a question of attacking one or another NATO country. It's even 1 square meter of NATO territory, and if that has issues, there won't be any trust in NATO again. And that is something that I believe, having been present in several NATO summits and talked myself to all NATO leaders, I don't think anyone is willing to let that happen. But what has been fundamentally right in this discussion is that, first of all, we have to keep in mind that right here, we are at the front line of democracy. When I was tweeting, we were encouraged to tweet earlier, and I was, among the first to tweet. Please, like it if you wish. When I chose the location, there were several spots reminding us how close to the Russian border we actually are right now. So that is the front line of democracy, and we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep that in mind because I will come back to that later, but I will argue that there is no way we in Europe can live in peace and prosperity when we know that there is ongoing war in that very Europe. Now, despite the warning signs, 2007 speech of Putin in Munich, actual conventional military attack against Georgia in 2008, several high-level military exercises throughout the years. Despite all of that pattern developing, I would argue that we didn't actually see it before 2014 early days, February in Crimea, and then the events that we all here know very well. I think 2014 was a massive eye-opener for many European countries. And that was, of course, obviously a very painful eye-opener. Until that date, there was still some understanding that we could live in good partnership with Russia, that Russia might be a somewhat democratic country that accepts the same principles that we do. And that, I think, even continued for a couple of months after the war or after annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. But I do think that this naive way of thinking is gone by now. And why do I think it is that all of European countries have witnessed, or most European countries have witnessed that in addition to the ongoing war in Ukraine and the still ongoing occupation of part of Georgia, which we should keep in mind as well, there have been attempts to undermine the unity of the European Union countries in many occasions. And until recently, that seemed to be some sort of worry of the Eastern EU countries, which now we have understood that was a very wrong perception, because tools like propaganda, false information, cyber attacks, energy have not been used against only the countries that are immediately bordering Russia, but those tools have been used in Germany, in France very recently, in US, perhaps in UK. So we have to keep that in mind. And as the toolbox is very wide, you have to keep in mind also that in some places it is possible to use conventional military force, but in those countries that are part of military alliances that are way stronger than Russia, the toolbox might become more kind of hybrid. And I think the aim is actually somewhat similar to why military tools were used in Ukraine. I don't think that Putin actually needs the beaches of Crimea. I think he invaded Crimea to prohibit Ukraine from joining EU and NATO. That is the path that I think Ukrainian people would have taken, or Ukrainian politicians for that matter as well, would have taken Ukraine eventually. And I think that was Putin's understanding that this big country, this big neighboring country, is slipping away to democracy, slipping away to for values that we all keep very, very important for ourselves. And also, of course, using the tools or hybrid tools in Western Europe or any part of Europe for that matter should be taken very, very seriously as well, because you don't need a conventional warfare always to change a country's course. If you can change the presidential elections, that was the attempt, in my opinion, in France. Fortunately, that didn't go this way that Putin planned. But if you can change the course of presidential elections without conventional war, well, that will be even cheaper for you to do. So I believe that we should take all of those attempts extremely seriously, and we should be ready to counter them as we are, or as we should be ready to counter military attacks as well. Now, the positive thing is that most of Europe, in my opinion, has understood that. And that has also led to unprecedented unity in terms of keeping the sanctions policy alive, which, of course, there's no need to say needs to continue. And that is probably the strongest way of sending the message that this conflict will continue to be very expensive for Kremlin. Also keeping the eyes open on all sorts of conflicts emerging on European soil. Understanding that any country can be a target for that matter, and the ultimate goal is not to fire gunshots. The ultimate goal is to undermine the European unity. Something that happened in this extent only a couple of decades ago. That's less than 30 years since the Berlin Wall came down. It's a little bit more than 25 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. And already we are in this situation where we see that the other team, not playing by the rules, is trying to challenge all the positive that we have created in this short time. So I think this topic is extremely timely. I think the panelists are very well chosen in this respect, that we all have somewhat different experiences and different perspectives to that. But my strongest point that I wanted to make here today is that our security in Europe is indivisible. And we have to keep in mind that Europe is not free, prosperous, and at peace until we have the control, or Ukraine has the control over all of its territories, which, by the way, is mentioned in the Minsk agreement. And in my opinion, all of its territories can only mean East Ukraine plus Crimea. And secondly, Europe cannot be peaceful and prosperous until a rather big part of Georgia is still occupied. Again, let's keep that in mind as well. We should never forget that this is an ongoing conflict as well. So thank you for your attention, and I would gladly answer all of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you also for being that short. Henrik, Mortensen, you would prefer to address us from the podium. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion. I think it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, in all my political life, has always been sort of at the forefront, fighting for freedom and democracy. I'm also here as the Vice President of ALDE and speaking on behalf of ALDE. And it'd be a pleasure for me to make a statement on behalf of ALDE. And I must say I'm particularly happy and honored to be here with some of the people who made me a Vice President of ALDE. So thank you so much. Well, basically, security policy could be a non-politically term for the aim to protect and preserve the sovereignty of any country, or indeed, as we're talking about today, Eastern Europe. As such, security policy is a concern of every country, be that Russia, Iran, India, my own country, Denmark, or Ukraine. And one could think of the multitude of tools that could be employed for the purpose of security policy. Military strength, think of the United States. Aggressive attitudes, think of Russia. Or defensive isolation, think of Japan. Or ideological oppression of your own people, think of North Korea. So any nation will have its own important concerns about security and define its own security policy. The issue of security policy will therefore be of great importance and relevance to any country, be it a communist country, an Islamist country, a nationalist totalitarian, or even a democratic country. However, I'm a liberal, and as such, to me, a discussion about security policy must involve a more elaborate and complicated task. We're not just talking about how we can protect a certain number of people on a certain piece of land. We should, as liberals, be thinking about how can we protect and preserve and develop a society based on democratic and liberal values, not on any accidental set of values. Now, we are gathered here at FNF conference, and as I said, I'm here as a representative of ALDE and as a member of Venstre, the Liberal Party in Denmark. So when we want to exchange views on the new security policy of Europe, what we should discuss is not merely how can the territorial integrity of the Ukraine or Southeast Europe be preserved. One might argue that such a narrow discussion on security policy could have been limited to a gathering of very capable experts on military tools, capacities and alliances, and not broad political agendas. No, because we are liberals, and as liberals we want to build societies which offer citizens a life in freedom, a life where citizens are allowed the pursuit of happiness, as the writers of the American Declaration of Independence would have formulated it. A life where social dignity is observed and for all citizens, and as all true European liberals would demand. We liberals are signatories to what has become known as the liberal world order after World War II. It has embraced liberal democracy, self-determinations of people, industrial capitalism, secular nationalism, open trade, human rights, and the rule of law. This is the system which is being challenged today. We liberals, of course, realize that we must make sure that such liberal societies are able to defend themselves from threats abroad, threats from countries and politicians who typically do not feel restricted by the same limitations which we as liberals put on our own actions and our own societies. To put it another way, how can we as liberals create and preserve free and liberal societies even when we are faced by economic crisis at home and abroad? How can we deal with the understandable but unrealistic desire of millions of poor Arabs and Africans who wants to get their share of the wealth of Europe and their share of European ways of life? And how should we deal with the militant Islamist nuclear armed rogue states like North Korea or Iran? Or how should we deal with aggressive and totalitarian expansionists like Putin's Russia? What are the internal characteristics of such a liberal society which we should seek to protect through our security policy? Well, first of all, a society must be based on all the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. I'll not give you an exhaustive account, but we're talking about the freedom of expression, the right to assemble, the right to travel, the right to vote in secrecy, protection from government interference into your personal life, respect for property rights, the right to choose one's religion, the right to choose one's partner and to live according to one's sexual orientation, etc. But there will also have to be a democratic superstructure, the institutions which come on top of individual rights and freedom. I'm thinking of the division of power between the legislative and executive authorities and an independent judiciary. The freedom of the press and the right to take part in meaningful democracy, that is the right of the majority to throw out the president or parliament and perhaps carry through a peaceful peaceful transition of power. We need the rule of law, we need transparency in public affairs, and we need to fight consistently against corruption. All this make up the internal fabric of an individual country which wants to be seen as a liberal democracy. In the EU, these shared values have been combined with economic liberalism, which have tied these countries together. As an EU citizen, one enjoys 4 freedoms, 4 economic freedoms: the movement of labor, the movement of goods, the movement of services, and the movement of capital. Societies based on these democratic values and economic ideas will never be a threat to any of their neighbors. Germany, for example, has not behaved aggressively towards any of its neighbors for more than 70 years. Neither has my own country, Denmark, for that sake. However, even liberal democracies have to care about their national security, since they may well be surrounded by countries that do not share our liberal values and visions. Take, as an example, South Korea in relation to North Korea, Taiwan in relations to communist China, or even more relevant in our part of the world, the relations between the Baltic states and Russia. But it's almost self-evident that non-aggressive liberal democracies should come together to shield themselves from outside threats as part of their security policy. This is the rationale behind NATO. It is also a rationale behind the emerging idea that the EU should put more emphasis on shared interests in the field of security policy. So countries can band together and share their common security interests. And I'll argue that countries based on liberal democratic values in most cases will have an interest in combining their security policy considerations and their military capacity so that they can increase the national security of each and every one of the countries. As such, I believe that under most general terms, the combination of the democratic quality of the EU and the military commitments of NATO is as close as any country can get to guarding its security in the Europe of our time. Today, you'll find that a high number of European countries enjoy the security which can be found in the membership of both unions and alliances. And I understand perfectly well that such a dual membership can seem very attractive to any country facing threats and isolation on its own, perhaps in the light of threatening behavior of its neighbors. And yet the Ukraine could be a very, very relevant example of such a country. However, there are unfortunately a number of reasons why an invitations to join either NATO or the EU can be difficult to issue. And we now enter what we could call the brutal realm of reality in which we live. The vicious world where some characteristics of a country prevent it from receiving the unambiguous label of being a democracy, and the world where security political choices cannot be made without a pragmatic view as to the realities of the political and military theater surrounding any given country. Countries like my own Denmark and Holland enjoyed the privileges of being founding members of NATO. Holland even enjoyed being a founding member of the EU. The historical, the political, and the security circumstances allowed the Dutch to join both of these attractive clubs right from the start. Others have had to wait for their turn. Denmark became a member of the EU when it was a well-established community. And Denmark could join because it managed to fulfill all the conditions which must be fulfilled for membership. We could join NATO as well as the EU at a time and under circumstances which did not give rise to any serious economic or security policy repercussions. Now take Sweden and Finland. They joined EU long after it was established. But even after the Berlin Wall came down, both countries decided to bide their time and pass by the open window of NATO membership. The reality of the world, of Europe and of the Nordic region is such that this open window probably has been closed for Sweden and Finland. An application for membership from these countries to NATO would cause serious drama in relation to Russia. Take another example. Turkey became a member of NATO without being anywhere near a democracy. Even NATO has to be pragmatic, a pragmatic player. And Turkey became a member of NATO because the political risk to NATO of letting Turkey drift in whichever direction was too much of a risk, a serious risk for the NATO alliance. But Turkey these days is far from bringing itself in a position where it can enjoy membership of NATO as well as the EU. Actually, in my view, Turkey is even pretty much becoming a political democratic embarrassment for NATO. But the relations between Turkey, NATO, and the EU just underline that the world cannot be governed by our liberal and idealistic dreams alone. There is a harsh reality out there which we have to face. The Baltic countries, Bulgaria, Romania, to name a few, joined both EU and NATO. They did not miss the window which history and NATO and EU had opened up. And today, these countries, like other Central and Eastern European countries, have experienced and enjoyed the privileges of communities made up of NATO and the EU. It would definitely be in the interest of the EU and of NATO and of Ukraine to try to create the circumstances where Ukraine, just like Holland, Denmark, or the Baltic countries, could enter the European and transatlantic fellowships. But such a development must involve a number of vital changes. First of all, Ukraine must make a successful effort to evolve into a fully democratic society with all the liberties and all the social fabric that I mentioned at the outset of my presentation here today, and which must be observed if you want to become a member of the EU. And I know this is a daunting task. The eradication of corruption and the introduction of the rule of law took decades in most countries, including my own, but it has to be done. And it is a task which the political establishment of Ukraine must come together to solve. Political leadership is indispensable, and the Ukrainians must do it on their own. Others cannot lift this responsibility. However, the EU and my own country should stand beside Ukraine and assist in any way possible. For example, through the anti-corruption program, of which my own country is deeply involved in. The very serious military issues and the completely unacceptable Russian annexation of the Crimea and the invasion into eastern Ukraine and the help to the so-called rebels are very unpleasant proofs of the real world in which we are living. NATO, the EU, and particularly Germany and France through the Normandy process must put all possible and necessary pressure on Russia. We have to realize that the security for Ukraine must be established before we can walk down the path which one day could allow the Ukraine, if it chooses, to get more formal and well-functioning relationships to NATO and to the EU. And by the way, as liberals, we should never accept in our political view or in our idealistic dreams nothing apart from the Ukrainians being able to themselves to decide whether they should someday seek membership of NATO and or the EU. But as I have reminded myself and you several times already, we live in a cruel world which prevents us from enjoying the democratic societies in a military secure environment. Even the American President Trump has created intolerable insecurity about the American international values and the American commitment to the spirit and obligations of NATO. Uncertainty is one of the worst ingredients anyone can introduce into a volatile international environment where several actors have no reservations in taking advantage of the weakness or the indecisions of others, such as Russia, as has already been mentioned. The decision of Brexit severely threatens the international weight of the EU and indeed of Britain, which may very well end up like a Singapore-like city-state with an impoverished hinterland of Wales and Northern England. Turkey is drifting towards a totalitarian future with an unknown mission towards the Middle East and Russia and further away from the EU than ever. It could very well be argued, and I will argue, that in this situation, the EU and Ukraine share so many common interests. The security of Europe could be enhanced by a stable and secure Ukraine, which has found its rightful place in the European and North Atlantic family. Ukraine has a well-educated and hard-working population which could contribute so much to the future political development and the future prosperity of Europe. I hope that our conversations here today and tomorrow can contribute to building the foundation of such a development. Thank you.
Thank you all for your contributions. They have been, this is of course the catchword, all interesting in the literal sense of the word, of the Latin verb interesse, that is to be involved. You have shown to us that we indeed are all involved in these problems of security. And you have shown to us not only that Eastern Europe matters, but also how that part of the world affects us all. Mr. Grytsenko, you painted a rather gloomy picture. And yes, indeed, that's the problem. It's real, realistic. You pointed, you underlined the military side of security and very much doubted that the present security policy posture of the West is up to the challenges you see. You weren't that pessimistic, Mr. Rõivas, and pointed to the unity of the alliance, of the Western alliance, as the main guarantor of its security, as far as I have understood. And you, Henrik Mortensen, it seemed to me, were in favor of a mixed picture, so to speak, as a combination of military side of security policy mixed with civil aspects. And you pointed to the Ukrainian example the successful development of Ukraine would be one side of a future real security for Ukraine. But I think we have some difficulties because we all more or less agree on that. You don't exclude civil matters of the security notion, Mr. Grytsenko, but you stress the shortcomings, and they are indeed real. When we are all in agreement, then about the substance what was presented here, then we face a difficulty because to structure discussion when all are in agreement is more or less difficult. Do we disagree to an extent that would warrant a lively discussion or an argument, an exchange of valid arguments? At the time being, I can't see this. So I would like to come back to the question asked here at our conference. A new security policy for Eastern Europe, question mark. Do we need a new security policy? And if so, how and why would it differ from the old version of security policy for Eastern Europe? Now, has there been really a security policy for Eastern Europe? Do we have a shared understanding of the exact security policy as we have had it up to now? I'm a little bit doubtful. So this would be my question. I would ask you, as giving you some food for thought, what do we need a new security policy, and what was the old one like? Who would like to start?
Well, first of all, what is Eastern Europe? If we go north, we find Finland. Finland is an Eastern European country. Finland is not a member of NATO, so in theory, there is no kind of clear commitment to protect it against any possible military threats. Do we as EU countries accept that we don't do it when Finland would be attacked? Well, I as an immediate neighbor would say, of course we wouldn't accept that. So there would have been, or should be, kind of military interventions or kind of intervening to it military. Is Eastern Europe only those countries who are have been occupied by Soviet Union for 50 years? Well, in this case, again, some of those countries are now members of NATO, who have, as you rightfully said, the highest possible security guarantee. Some of them are not. So basically, again, there is no clear understanding or homogeneity in this. My argument is that we should talk about new security policy for Europe. I think the NATO meeting, which was not the summit, but was a NATO meeting in Brussels recently, gave a very, very clear understanding of that. Donald Trump was not particularly polite in pointing out the shortcomings in security expenditures, but he was not completely wrong of doing that, because let's remember that 2006 already, that commitment was agreed on by all NATO member states. Let's remember that during the previous US President Barack Obama, that commitment was kind of complete over and over again, repeated. I was there in Wales when we pointed out that topic as well. So basically, to have a stronger Europe, we need to step up our military deterrence, and that's a fact, and many countries have understood that. So we don't actually need Donald Trump to point that out. We know that many of the countries are doing that already. For example, Denmark is investing in biggest ever military expenditure right now, buying a fleet of F-35s, which is very, very impressive. But just very shortly, I want to point out that in order to be strong as Europe, we have to keep in mind, and you, I think, pointed it out in your introductory remarks, that it's not only military deterrence, it's also the strength of the society overall. It's the question of how free is our media in order to counter propaganda. It's also how coherent is the society to understand and actually also dismiss the false information. It's also the question of how well our information systems are protected against all possible cyber attacks. And last but not least, the topic that was also brought up, how energy independent we are. I would argue Estonia, by the way, is the least energy dependent country in EU, because we have very good connections to both north and south. So we are not dependent on Russian energy at all, and we have our own energy production. But there are many countries everywhere in Europe who actually are very dependent on Russian energy. And that's, again, not only a question of Eastern European countries. I would argue that also Germany is very dependent on Russian gas because of the Nord Streams and so on. So I would argue that we should talk about European security policy as a whole, because I can't see any kind of division there. And then, you know, coming back to the first point, what is Eastern Europe? Where do we draw the line? Is it this or that side of Finland?
Thank you. You said gloomy picture, rather not so optimistic assessment. If I see nice ladies, they are nice. If I see that Minsk, and if I see it's killing Ukraine, there are two options. Say that, or repeat the mantra, no alternative, everyone must do and fix, etc. I chose the first. Let's imagine simple case. Everyone almost in this audience has such an age like myself. I have 4 kids. You have a kid, temperature is 40 plus, burning. You ask doctor, physician, prescribe some pills or shots, no help. Next day, the same. Next day, the same. Next day, the same. And we will repeat mantra, there is no alternative. Kill the kid, or we will replace doctor, or replace treatment, or something else, right? 2.5 years ago, Minsk document was signed. Signed by whom? None of the leaders signed. They knew it was wrong from the very beginning. They moved beyond their authorities and commitments, including Poroshenko. He didn't sign. He kind of empowered former President Kuchma and 2 representatives from Donetsk and Lugansk who are under investigation in Ukraine for terrorist actions, and OSCE representative. So what are the basis of the document? Then, since then, we declared, presidents of Ukraine declared 100+ no fighting periods, etc. Every day, fighting, killing, wounded. Every day your kid is dying. It's the first line in that agreement. Next line, removal of weapons is not fulfilled. Next one, exchange of those captures, not fulfilled, and further on. 2+ years. I said about the kid, if it's business kind of treatment, Friedrich Foundation decided to rent this hall. They came in, someone else is sitting. Next time the same, next time the same, next time the same. Would they repeat dealing with that hotel? Continue the mantra, no alternative of the hotel in Kharkiv? Or what else should I give you as an example to show it's wrong? Of course, we are informed optimists. We say less than we know. If you want to hear more, I can tell you that Minsk document was not drafted neither in Kiev, nor in Berlin, nor in Paris. It was drafted in Kremlin by Putin plus Surkov. We know that 100% probability for sure. It just happened that my wife is editor-in-chief of Zerkalo Nedeli newspaper in Kiev. 2 days before the Minsk summit, they published the draft they extracted from their Russian sources. That draft prepared in Kremlin was approved by Poroshenko, Putin, Hollande, and Merkel. It was approved in a way that Putin wrote a letter to the two Western leaders, threatening them. They stopped all their business. They had flown immediately to Kiev, took Poroshenko, and moved to Minsk, 3 of them. When it was signed, did anyone, Merkel or Hollande or Poroshenko, appeared in front of media, happy, shaking hands, presenting that happy, optimistic deal? None of them. It's not European practice. Through the back door, they had flown back home. Only Putin appeared and said, we are guarantors, we are not aggressor. We had taken no commitment on Ukraine. It's internal Ukrainian conflict. And everyone in the world was buying all that garbage. And till now, 2+ years. Can we repeat that mantra? I understand that Denmark, some other countries within the European Union and NATO would like to see Ukraine as a member, but not all of them. Because the deal not to allow Ukraine NATO membership was blessed, if I can say so, by President of France, Hollande. On the eve of his visit to Minsk, he sent clear message and stressed that message. Ukraine will not become a NATO member. And it's a quote. We sent that message to some concerned Russian leadership, blah, 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 to calm them down to sign that Minsk deal. So Ukraine, if we are thinking or speaking in terms of practical policies, should forget the reality of NATO membership in the near future, at least 10+ years. Not because of us. We are more ready to join NATO than Romania, was, Bulgaria was, I would not name Spain, Turkey, and many other countries. Hungary including, etc., etc. Much more ready. I used to be a defense minister, member of parliament. I know the reality of interoperability, compatibility, level of diplomatic civilian control, combat readiness of the armed forces, not compared with some, or at least 10+ new NATO members that have brigade or maximum half corps level equivalent of the armed forces. We are contributors to the security, but we will not become a NATO member. Is this gloomy picture, it's a reality should be based on our policy on?
It's both gloomy and realistic.
Okay, I believe it's realistic.
And you mean, I mean, you have, of course, pointed to the shortcomings, to put it mildly, of the Minsk agreement. You could also argue it was a diktat from the Russian side, without any doubt. But where's the alternative? Where's the alternative?
Okay, if you ask, I can give you the alternative. Where is an exit? Where the entrance is, right? We came in, we will leave the room through the same door. 3+ years ago, Ukraine was a peaceful country, I started with that, within internationally recognized borders. So that must be the end of any diplomatic plus financial sanctions, military, etc. efforts. If that is not the case, if we exclude, like in the Minsk arrangement, Crimea, it's not a sustainable decision. It's not fair decision. So must be there. In full understanding that some of the goals will be achieved later on. Second, it must be a just decision. Aggressor must be named aggressor. Aggressor must pay for their own deeds, for killed, for destroyed economy, etc. If Europe, if Merkel, Hollande, anyone else, Macron, I don't know yet, are afraid to name Putin aggressor, and they are still in in cosmos somewhere, they're able to please him, shaking hands, etc. He is not the guy whom you can convince by giving for reading global declarations, constitutional rights, freedoms, liberal values, etc. He accepts only force, nothing else. Yeah. It must be understood. And to finish optimistically, it's not my saying, one of your predecessors from your own country. Russia is not, or is never as weak as it seems to be. But Russia is never as strong as it pretends to be. So don't be afraid. Don't make yourself afraid that Russia can deploy 1 million troops. just to deploy through few brigades. They had empty barracks up to the Urals. And they have huge territory, and they have China, and they have crazy noise Korea, etc. And they have limited budget, and many other things limited. And their leadership is vulnerable. So we can work if we are not afraid, seriously. And we can make a real sustainable deal. Because if a country, unlike Ukraine or Estonia, with full respect Denmark, 1 out of 5 on the globe took responsibility to ensure peace and stability on the globe, and it became an aggressor, and we just buy that, and we acknowledge as a guarantor, something really wrong with the value system. On values, the EU is based, right? Something wrong is with double standards and some other things. We should speak about that. We should convince our leaders to change their position. Otherwise, they will return back from next meeting with some paper decisions which will not be accepted by the societies at large for a decade at least. Thank you.
I see your point, and by the way, I agree with it. But we should not forget about the question, do we need a new security policy for Eastern Europe? Henrik Mortensen.
Yes, you were a bit disappointed in saying that you couldn't really find so many disagreements of what we were saying. Well, being part of the same liberal family, I think it's okay and very useful that we do not disagree that violently. I think what the issue here is not to solve disagreements. Actually, we're in a situation that what we need to do is to try to help each other to find a way out of the mess we're in. Because things have really changed over the last, say, 30 years. And the changed circumstances are not at all pleasant to Europeans. First of all, one of the things underlying, at least what I said, is that we are much weaker than we were 20, 30 years ago. We face threats from Russia and from ISIS and everywhere else. And at the same time, we're losing the support of Americans, and the British have decided to drift out into the Atlantic on their own. So it's not easy for Europe, in some sense, to flex its muscle and do whatever we want. We have to realize that we live under circumstances where we are not as strong as we used to be, and we have to work on how to find solutions which can create those open windows that I mentioned, which someday in 5, 10, 15, 20 years could mean that, for instance, the Ukraine could join the rest of the family in NATO and EU. This is not something, these are not circumstances we can create from one day to another, but this is something we have to work on continuously and so as to create the set of circumstances which could be helpful. And one of the things we should do, for instance, you could do in Ukraine, is to work on the internal economic and democratic strength of the Ukraine. I mean, the greatest threat to Putin from the Ukraine was to develop a prosperous, truly democratic society, which all Russians would envy the Ukrainians. I realize it's not easy, as I said, it's a very, very difficult task, but it's the only long-term goal we can work for. And of course, European countries in other than military ways should help in this. I think we have to realize, as has been mentioned and as I understand Merkel has tweeted, we have to realize that the Europeans have to pull up ourselves on our own. We have to come together in new ways and create a new European strength where we solve the security issues of Europe, ISIS and Russia and other threats. We have to build a stable European economy where we solve the crisis with the euro and other economic aspects. And we have to find solutions to the very visible problems which are felt strongly by the European populations on immigration and so on. All these things needs our attention because we have to create the European strength more or less from the ground again. Hopefully, in doing that, we can increase the strength of Europe and the Ukraine to make Ukraine able to choose its own destiny. Until then, we have to realize what the kind of world we're living in and do the best we can. And as you said, I don't think we have any illusions about Russia and Putin, but some of us, or some of the countries in Europe, are heavily dependent on Russia, and that has some effects on how you can treat Russia in negotiation circumstances.
Well, this last point was, of course, very important. You really tend to think that there are nations, countries in Europe, heavily, as you said, dependent on energy deliveries from the Soviet Union, from Russia, and that's why they are. Well, I just refer to what you have.
But I mean, any country which is heavily dependent on Russian energy, for instance, has to think of what would happen if the Russian gas was shut off from one day to another. That's, of course, something which you cannot risk. And of course, Russia couldn't risk it either, because that would limit their earnings from the western and central part of Europe. But we have to realize that we are not only acting in a position of strength where we can force the Russians and others to do exactly what we want. We have to be more considerate. We have to realize that we are, in many circumstances, acting from a weaker position than we are used to.
Okay, Mr. Grytsenko?
Let me just add to your point. That's why I started my presentation with recalling 4 wars. The West Energy War, which for smart people, I believe smart people are united within the EU, smart leadership, was a real warning sign that you must not depend on one source only. Since 2006, now it's 2017, any EU member state, if persistent, could have avoided dependence of Russia. I was a defense minister then in 2006. I recommended next defense ministerial for the discussion of energy security issues. I was not understood then within European partners. It took 3 years for them. Next war, 2009, only then they decided to discuss that issue seriously. But if we repeat that argument that some EU, NATO member states are heavily dependent on Russian supplies, it's a quote, then you should not be very optimistic that if, I knock the wood, Russian tanks will start crossing Estonian border, those heavily dependent nations would be very happy to immediately start sending their F-35, etc., to protect Estonia. It's also reality. If reality is much more important than law, international law, moral issues, etc., guys, then we would lose World War II, World War I, Nazi would take over the globe, etc. Then some countries were also heavily dependent on supply from Germany or relations with Germany. But if it's really value-based understanding, then we will look for solutions. If we are dependent and we play tactical, also important policy issues, then we will look for excuses. And then I see other future, and I wrote that future back in 2008 when I saw the reaction of EU, NATO on the war against Georgia. Within 10 years, you say, or 10, 15 years, Ukraine may join NATO, etc. Maybe within 10 years, NATO will disappear, or EU or Eurozone will disappear if some important really needed things are not implemented within those unions. They must be effective, efficient. I have, of course, as anyone, some reservation regarding Trump, but right he is. Germany, rich country, cannot spend 2 pennies from every euro for defense, only 1, and prolonging that period for 15 or so years. Well, something wrong is within the country. Or we may put another issue. How many really people within every EU member state society are ready to fight for freedom, for other values? I have real doubts. Just imagine the referendum in the Netherlands, we know about the association agreement with Ukraine. Just try to simulate, run that referendum in every EU country. What would be the result? I bet in all countries will be negative results. Probably Lithuania could be, or maybe Estonia. No one else. And it's not issue of Ukraine. It's lack of real trust and sustainability and positive feelings within the EU itself. Ukraine is only just part of that referendum issue. So some systemic problems should be quickly fixed within EU and NATO, in security sphere as well. That's why I wrote that article on the EU ALDE site you can read. And it's not gloomy picture, it's absolutely reality. If something seriously wrong after 4 wars forgiven for Putin, and I would not ask in this audience, but you can ask within the European Parliament, how many MPs can stand up and say, Putin is aggressor. It's a war. And you will see how divided is even the parliament. Or you can ask heads of states, how many of them, Baltic states would say, France, no, Germany, no, Spain, no, Belgium, no, Italy, no, etc., etc. Is it a real unity based on values? Or we should politely avoid such discussions? Then we are, as people who through brainstorming ideas can feed them with some positive solutions, are not fulfilling our task. That's why I thank yourself, Friedrich, Naumann, the possibility to discuss those issues in frank environment. Because if they meet the G7, it's not frank environment. They have already prepared protocol and they just change couple of words, nothing else.
So would you all agree when I say it should probably become worse before it becomes better?
Mm-hmm.